Yesterday, we got our first official sneak peek at the 2024 Monster Manual, and though we didn't get any new monster reveals through it, we did get some in other places that I will mention, but we did get a ton of new information not only about the philosophy of the new book, but also about some of the specific and general types of changes that we can expect to see once the new Monster Manual finally arrives. Spoilers, the new book is genuinely looking to be a straight fire. Probably the best of the three so far. It honestly looks like it's worth buying even if you still plan to stick with 2014 content, just because of how much better things are looking. Anyway, the reveal video was like a full hour long and it was kind of all over the place, so I've condensed it all down here and I've organized it into two core sections: design philosophies and changes. So with all that said, let's just get into it. And I should say that no, I do not have an advanced copy of the Monster Manual, and no, this video is not sponsored by Wizards of the Coast. We're going to start with the overall philosophies before moving into some of the changes. Firstly, there's a lot of creatures. We're told that there's over 500 monsters in the book. That's a lot. Now, it should be mentioned that not all of these are new. The vast majority of them existed in the 2014 Monster Manual or have been moved over from other monster supplements that have been released over the last few years. And that even seems to be true of many of the, quote, 80 new creatures that they've added. What they really mean is new to the Monster Manual. That said though, there are some genuinely new creatures in the book, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, in order to find all of these creatures, they've also decided to greatly refine the organization of the book. It's no longer organized alphabetically by creature type, but rather alphabetically by name. They joked about not wanting someone to have to know enough about D&D to know that in order to find a gelatinous cube, they would need to look under O for ooze. And honestly, I like this move a lot. I remember these exact types of things confusing me and honestly kind of annoying me when I first started, so I appreciate that they have done this, but maybe that's just me. And especially so since the creature type is listed on the block anyway, it's not like it's a mystery. Beyond that though, in order to make the book more functional and to better support DMs, the back of it contains monster lists broken down by challenge rating, by creature type, by environment, and subgroup. So this way you can still easily find all of your oozes if you wanted to, or if you're looking for a number of monsters that are all typically found in the same general location, you can do that here. I love this change. On the subject of making things easier for Dungeon Masters though, some of the other new things that they've done is to create a whole new section at the beginning of the book that provides guidance for running monsters in combat. The general gist of this seems to be ensuring that you are running the enemy at its most effective, and including things to be on the lookout for and to ensure that you are using, like legendary actions, which turns out have not been completely removed from the game. More on that later though. But yeah, this is a really great thing to see that they have incorporated into the book. Advice and tips, especially for new DMs, is always something that I value highly since it can allow the game to feel more accessible and allow more DMs to feel comfortable understanding everything that they're looking at and how to make the most out of it. These types of inclusions are always welcome in my eyes. On that note, they did make another change to some of the structure of the book, which you may or may not enjoy depending on your tastes. They mentioned that they have backed off on providing as much heavy lore on monsters and instead focused a little bit more on the basics of the creatures, things that they might typically do in some of the general lore. They haven't gone particularly deep though, but make no mistake, there is still a reasonable amount of things to learn, just not probably as much as you're accustomed to if you're comparing it against something like Volo's Guide to Monsters. The stated design goal of this was to not overburden players and DMs with information, but to instead encourage them to use their own imaginations to fill in the blanks or to utilize other resources to discover even more. And I get it, I can appreciate that. However, as a self-professed lore junkie, I would always say yes to more lore, but again, I know where I can find my own resources. Hopefully though, we do get additional monster supplements in the future that go a little bit heavier on it though. As far as the philosophical changes go though, probably the single biggest one was the fundamentally different approach that they've taken to calculating challenge rating as compared to 2014, which certainly helps explain so many of the differences that we're seeing between monsters. Now, this is actually not the first time that Jeremy Crawford has gone on record saying this. He did mention this whole thing during a live stream around the time that The Wild Beyond the Witchlight was released, when referencing the then updated stat blocks. He mentioned that back in 2014, the way that the team determined challenge rating, particularly for high-level creatures, was to identify what the optimal or best or most damage-dealing play was and base the CR off of that metric. There is some logic to this, but it does help explain why CR was so often a terrible metric for determining the actual effectiveness of a given creature, since it involved identifying a very specific play pattern that may or may not even be possible, and then executing on that. Basically, he was saying that CR was largely a hypothetical measurement of the upper limit of a monster, just not the average. However, now with the new monster manual, they're changing that in a big way. And to be clear, we have already seen how this is manifested in a few creatures that have been released so far. I've made videos about all of them that I will leave linked at the end of this one if you want to check it out. But the intent now is that for the creatures, again particularly high level or legendary ones, to be so much more well-rounded and potent that they should be able to maintain that feeling of their challenge rating regardless of the line of play that the DM chooses. And on top of that, they have certainly gone out of their way to make it as easy as possible for a DM to identify what the most powerful options are, but then have still provided plenty of choices to make alternate decisions depending on the state of the game. One of the biggest manifestations of this is that multi-attacks are now significantly more versatile than they were in 2014. Previously, it was very common for only melee attacks to get multi-attack, or for ranged ones to get fewer attacks. Now, a much more common trend that we are seeing is for them to be able to be used interchangeably, which is a massive deal, not only for the effectiveness and perceived effectiveness of a creature, but also to be able to adapt to different game states much more reliably. Overall, this massive shift in design philosophy surrounding challenge rating sounds great, and the examples that we have seen so far are very promising, but we will need to reserve full judgment until the book is in our hands and we can do some deep dives on it. And by the way, I plan to really dive deep on the monster manual, so if you're into monster design, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on that. I'm gonna get real nerdy. So those are all the main changes as far as design philosophy goes for the new book, but now let's look at some more of the mechanical ones. First, the big one, legendary actions. After we saw the Ancient Green stat block released a couple of months ago, it seemed extremely likely that legendary actions were disappearing entirely from the book since the Ancient Green Dragon did not have any. However, we can now confirm that that is not actually the case. Colby from D&D Deep Dive was given the Empyrean stat block to reveal, and it does in fact include legendary actions. Interestingly though, it does not include the expanded set of what are essentially legendary reactions, which is what we saw on the Ancient Green Dragon, so this does raise the question of how these will be divided up between creatures. Which ones are going to get legendary actions, which are going to get additional reactions, and which, if any, are going to get both. That's something that I guess we're also going to have to wait and see for. Regardless, for those of you who were mourning the loss of legendary actions, it looks like they actually are here to stay. Now, on the subject of ancient dragons themselves, we did also get some more information. Firstly, they stated that all the dragons have been made both more potent and durable, basically across the board. This is something that we had already kind of seen with the Green Dragon, so it is nice to see it being applied more as well. Even if we expected it, it's nice to hear it. To accomplish this, ancient dragons have been given attacks that hit harder, have different damage types, have had changes to their hit points and armor, but also been given more tactical options, which probably refers to the slew of new reactions that we've also seen given. Additionally, it was confirmed that lair actions are still present, something that was kind of unclear from the Green Dragon stat block, but states that they have been moved into the block itself. This to me suggests that what I had suspected was going to be the lair actions really are it. On the Green Dragon, we saw that it got an extra legendary resistance while it was in its lair. I'm guessing that we're going to see more things like that that are simply baked into the stat blocks themselves. Rather than needing something else to do, being in the lair will likely just make the creature a little bit more potent. This does improve usability for the DM if true, but it does also take away some element of intensity if this really is the extent of it. But again, we don't know this for sure, this is just speculation on my part. Also on Ancient Dragons, a wonderful change to see is that they all, apart from the Ancient White Dragon, have now been given spellcasting. In 2014, there was an optional variant in a sidebar that explained this, but it wasn't particularly well known, so this change certainly amps up the danger and tactical options that a ferocious beast like this would have. One final note on dragons is that at no point during the video did they mention the great worms that we saw in Fizban's Treasury of Dragons. This to me suggests that they're not included in this book, which is a little bit of a disappointment if true. I would have loved to see them refined since the stat blocks we saw in Fizban's were a bit underwhelming, to be honest. Beyond dragons, we get some more information about different types of monster families. Something that's been brought up quite a few times during all of the release cycles so far has been that the team has worked to expand the range of monster families to be able to better provide for different levels of challenge for a certain type of creature at higher and lower challenge ratings. It's a big element of the book that I have been looking forward to. It's honestly quite often that I'll be looking at a creature and think, man, I wish I had this but like 10 CRs higher, or lower sometimes. And of course, you can absolutely do the work yourself and make these things stronger or weaker, but there's something very nice about having it done for you. Not only because it makes it easier to just pick up and run, but because it can also inspire your own creativity or ideas about how to modify other creatures that still don't have ones in the range that you're looking for. I'm super hyped for this. On that, goblins are getting some fun updates too. There are at least 2 new types of goblins included, a higher challenge rating Goblin Hexer, which is a spellcasting variant of the creature that was actually around in 4th edition as well, and the new very low CR Goblin Minion that, according to Jeremy Crawford, you can drop in by the truckload, which is a pretty amusing visual. We also got some more information about vampires, which has been a monster family that Jeremy Crawford has mentioned quite a few times at this point. He mentioned that there are at least 2 new vampires, one at a lower CR below vampire spawn, and one higher than the typical vampire as well. Additionally, he also mentioned that they all share some unique mechanical method of getting away in some capacity that helps demonstrate how tricksy and hard to catch vampires can be. This can range from the vampire spawn having an easily accessible disengage mechanic, to the standard vampire being able to fly away, but without needing to also transform into a bat first. I'm loving all the mechanical ties that make these creatures feel so much more unified. In addition to vampires and goblins and dragons, we also heard about a few tweaks being made to Death Knights. Particularly that there is also a new creature, the Death Knight Aspirant, which is essentially a champion of the Death Knight that it's also able to command. This not only makes the base Death Knight so much more fearsome in combat, since it's not simply commanding simple and weak skeletons, but some powerful enemies in their own right. But also, it can enable some even more smaller scale Death Knight experiences at a lower level. Oh, and the Tarrasque finally has a massive ranged effect, so there's that. As far as the monster changes go, that's about it for the big ones. However, we did also get some more updates about the stat blocks themselves and a little bit more context about what's going to be in the book. Firstly, the team is really doubling down on creature types and even subtypes to a large extent. Jeremy Crawford made a point of mentioning how one of the first things the team did when they began the process of making the new monster manual was to go through and ensure that each creature was appropriately tagged to represent its place in the D&D multiverse. I know when I showed off the Bugbear stat block in a previous video, many people wondered if the fact that it was listed as Fae was just for the adventure that it was in, which was Uni and the Hunt for the Lost Horn. I was fairly confident that it was going to be what we saw in the monster manual, and it does appear as if that is the case. Goblins are now confirmed to be Fae creatures, and gnolls are also considered to be fiends. So they've really made it a point to establish exactly what they believe each creature type to be, which does mean that, as I've mentioned before, spells that used to work on some creatures that were labeled as humanoid will just not work anymore if they don't have that humanoid tag. This could potentially be a very big deal depending on the types of characters at your table, and what creatures you most often run though. In addition to all of this, one of the more subtle changes that we saw included in the 2024 Player's Handbook was the return of the Bloodied condition, which was present in previous editions of the game, but was not there in 5e. The Life Cleric and a couple of other things referenced it, but one of my big hopes was that they would utilize the condition to a much higher degree on the new monsters, and it looks like that's exactly what's going to happen. Enemies that are bloodied now might activate some new abilities or become stronger or even potentially less strong depending on the monster type and what they're doing. This is a small but subtle thing to help keep an encounter feeling more dynamic as well. I love this change. We also learned a little bit more about what some of the monster descriptions will convey to us. Specifically, we are going to get more information about the environments that a creature is typically found in, what types of treasure it might be protecting or using, and it does also include references to the new Dungeon Master's Guide tables as well. We're also going to get different tables and lists to demonstrate the different characteristics of a creature, whether it's suggestions for things that a mimic can turn into, or different demeanors or attitudes that a group of performers might have. The goal here was really to sell that these creatures shouldn't just be text on pages, and that they don't have to play exactly the same way every single time that you run them. They really wanted to underscore that these creatures can all truly feel dynamic and more fluid and different every single time you play. One notable omission that was not brought up at all during the entire video was any information about creating new monsters. Now, the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide did include some very light information about how to customize monsters, but it was incredibly high level and really didn't give us any insight about how to create new monsters, especially considering their new approach to challenge rating. This is something that I and so many people were hoping would make its way into the new monster manual, but either it hasn't or they just didn't mention it. I'm kind of feeling like it's just not there, which to me is kind of a big letdown. Maybe we'll get some more guidance on it in the future in a different book, but who knows. So that's basically everything that we learned. I know that some other creators have been lucky enough to get some monster reveals like I mentioned earlier, like Colby from D&D Deep Dive, Dungeon Dad, and Pack Tactics, so be sure to check out their videos for more coverage on the new monster manual. I say this every time I finish a new monster video, but damn, I am so hyped for this book. I need it in my life now. Anyway, check out some of my other monster previews for the new monster manual if you haven't already, but otherwise, take care.